Thank you, Elizabeth, for that word. I'm a mom, and this is terrifying. Me being standing here is one of the scariest things I have ever done. So I have to tell you that as a mom, we teach by examples, and I'm so proud of being part of your tribe and just resist with you. So behind of me, there are 7 flags that represent the country that have the Muslim ban, and we add the Australian flag because we want to show support to refugees. And with that saying, I have to tell you about the march today. So the route is through Macquarie Street, then Bridge, Loftus and Fleet, First Fleet Park. And with that, I want to say welcome to Samuel Tho. He arrived in Australia in 1978 as a refugee from Vietnam. He joined the Salvation Army last year as a National Secretary. Please welcome Samuel Tho.
Well, firstly, I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, and I pay my respect to the leaders past and present. And I say this statement with utmost sincerity, realizing that this land has provided me a place to call home. And my name is Samuel Tho. I was a refugee from Vietnam in the late 70s. Every time a story appears in the media about asylum seekers or refugees, it pains me. I see them and I say, that was me. As different politicians say they will stop the boats, I tell myself, well, it's not me anymore. It's about another group of people. I try to tell myself that such harsh policies are needed to protect our borders. I have shed the clothes I wore after I landed here as a refugee from Malaysia in 1978. I'm an Australian now. And yet another piece of harsh legislation will not impact me, will it? But thinking that way means denying my own background and how I came to be who I am. If the Australian government had implemented the current pushback policies in the 70s, what would have happened to Vietnamese refugees like me, my younger brother, and thousands of refugees who fled the war and death? Would we still be in refugee camps? Or would we have died at sea, like so many thousands of refugees who headed to Malaysia out of Vietnam? Remember Alan Kurdi? Now this name might not ring the bell to you or a lot of people, but if I tell you Alan was a 3-year-old Syrian boy of Kurdish ethnic background who drowned on September 2nd, 2015 in the Mediterranean Sea. Remember the photograph? He and his family were Syrian refugees trying to reach Europe amid the European refugees crisis. None of the recent Australian policies from either side of the political fence have helped people like little Alan. The policies of punishment have made no positive impact on human suffering or the conflicts that cause people to flee their homes. The recent proposal to stop refugees from ever settling in Australia is supposedly aimed at the people considering fleeing on the illegal boats. It is a bad policy and bad politics. It is cruel. Some of my fellow Australians who fear people like me, people who look different and sound different, but banning people seeking asylum won't solve those fears. It will only create more division and hatred here in Australia. We have little diversity of representation in our political leadership and little understanding. Banning people seeking refuge and asylum will divide our rich and vibrant society even more. Do you ever think why people smugglers, those who capitalize on human desperation, exist? For those fleeing conflict zones like myself, smugglers are the only option to escape. And these asylum seekers are prepared to take the risk of dying at sea, just like many of my friends and thousands of Vietnamese refugees did after the war. Have you seen photographs of Home and Aleppo in Syria? That was Vietnam back then. There was no looking back. Whenever I hear Vietnamese settlement was the last global settlement of its kind, it's frightening because it's not like there are no more refugees. No one seeking asylum gets on a leaky boat without desperation. Ask yourself, What drives them to travel to an unknown destination on a small fishing boat without a compass in an open sea, without reliable navigation? Think about Syria, about Libya, about Iraq, about Afghanistan. Those people wouldn't have left their countries unless it was chosen between life and death for them and for their children. I have to insist all the time that I am not an immigrant, and my story is not an immigrant story. My understanding is that many new Australians are here because of the consequences of wars. Many immigrant stories and refugee stories need to be understood as war stories. Australia is still a work in progress, but we are better than offshore punishment. We are better than neglect and hatred and fear and racist claptrap. Australia has made a remarkable journey since 1901, when its political leaders passed draconian laws to protect the dream of a white nation. It's taken a century and more of struggle. But the immigration nation we live today has been achieved against the odds. It started this century with a massive contradiction. Its universal values of freedom and tolerance and fairness, but they've been restricted to white only. Now, finally, in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we still got the same core of Australian values and characteristics, but now they are not being restricted to any one race or sect. Any continent of the world is able to come to Australia and participate in that. Freedom, tolerance, fairness, we can make those qualities Australian policy again if we want to. Thank you very much.
So this week I had to explain to my child what all the violence was in TV. The use of chemical weapons and the recent retaliation bombing in Syria is a clearly reminder that Australia has got Syrian refugees in detention in Australia, in Manus and Nauru. Bombing creates refugees. Instead of supporting this bombing, Malcolm Turnbull should be welcome refugees. So we need a, say it loud! Refugees are welcome here. With that, I want you to welcome Dr. Sue Warholm. She